Hello and welcome to Chapter 5 of our last book of the Paddington series. Chapter 5 is called Paddington Spills the Beans. One bright December morning, Paddington decided to make himself useful in the garden. With Christmas not far away, he was anxious to earn some extra pocket money. So he set to work at the front of the house, clearing up the last of the autumn leaves and generally tidying up the flower beds. He didn't want a repeat of the previous year's debacle when he gave everyone in the family a diary he'd come across on a stall in the market. Like most bears, he had an eye for a bargain, and at the time 5 for the price of 1 sounded very good value indeed. It wasn't until halfway through Boxing Day afternoon when Mr. Brown laid down his pen at long last, having finished the arduous task of transferring all the names and addresses and birthday reminders from his old diary into the new one, that he happened to glance at the date and discovered the two were identical. Having swept the leaves into a tidy pile, Paddington took some secateurs out of his duffel coat pocket and turned his attention to the rose bushes in case they needed a final prune before winter set in. A quick glance decided him against it. The roses were Mr. Brown's pride and joy, and he went to great pains to ensure they were pruned close to an outward-facing bud. Whenever Paddington looked at them, the only buds he could find always seemed to face the wrong way, and that day was no exception. He was in the middle of taking a closer look at one of the stems through his magnifying glass when he heard a cough. Looking around, he realized he was being watched. "Ahem," said the man, looking over the railings. "Forgive me. I can see you're busy. Please don't bother to stand up." Paddington looked most offended. "I am standing up," he announced. "Oh." The newcomer sounded rather flustered. "I do beg your pardon, but I assumed you were a jobbing gardener. A refugee from some foreign clime, perhaps? I wonder, are your employers at home?" "My employers," repeated Paddington, growing more and more upset. "But I live here. I'm trying to make my ends meet in time for Christmas. I was looking for some outward-facing buds, but I can't find any." "I know just how you feel," said the man sympathetically. He held up a clipboard. "I'm trying to conduct a survey, but so far I haven't found a single person to interview. Everybody in the road seems to be out." "I expect it's because of your board," said Paddington knowledgeably. "Mrs. Bird says she never opens the door to a man with a clipboard. It usually means they're after something." "Ah," the man gave a hollow laugh. "Thank you very much for the tip. I'm not used to this kind of work, you see," and his voice trailed away under Paddington's gaze. Since you live here," he continued, "perhaps you wouldn't mind answering a few simple questions? It will only take up a minute or two of your valuable time. We are asking people about their views." "I have a very good one from my bedroom window," said Paddington, only too happy to oblige. "On a clear day I can see the British Telecom Tower." The interviewer allowed himself a smile. "How very interesting." He took a closer look at Paddington. "Forgive my mentioning it, but from your accent I take it you are not where exactly are you from?" "Peru," said Paddington. "Darkest Peru." "Darkest Peru," repeated the man. "I've come across a good many Bulgarians and Poles coming over here to work, but I've never met anyone from darkest Peru before." He consulted a sheet of his paper on his clipboard. "There isn't even a box I can tick. If you don't mind my saying so, I hope there isn't a flood this winter." "Mr. Curry had one last year," said Paddington. "He did?" exclaimed the man excitedly. He jotted the name down. "Perhaps you could give me his address. I'll see if I can jog his memory." "I would rather you didn't," said Paddington anxiously. "He's our next-door neighbour, and we don't get on very well." "Oh dear," said the man. "Does it bring back unhappy memories for you?" "No," said Paddington, "but it does for Mr. Curry. He had a burst pipe in his bathroom, and I was helping him mend it. He gave me a hammer to hold and told me that when he nodded his head I was to hit it. So I did. I didn't realize he meant the pipe." "I see the problem," agreed the man. "It's not something he would forget in a hurry." He turned over the page. "Changing the subject, do you have any complaints about the way you've been treated since you arrived in this country?" Paddington considered the matter for a moment. "Well, it wasn't Mrs. Bird's fault," he said, "but my boiled egg was a bit runny this morning." "Your boiled egg was a bit runny." The man had started to write something down, but he crossed it out. "I hardly think that's a reasonable cause for complaint." "It is if you're a bear," said Paddington hotly. "If you're a bear and the yolk dries on your whiskers, it makes them stick together, and it's very painful. It hurts every time you open your mouth." Yes," said the interviewer, "I suppose it would. Did you register a complaint?" Paddington looked taken aback at the thought. "I wouldn't dare," he said. "Mrs. Bird rules the house with a rod of iron." "Really? The man looked around nervously. Does she carry it with her? Oh, it's only a pretend one, said Paddington, but she can be a bit fierce at times. Mr. Brown says that deep down she has a heart of gold. Anyway, she's out with Mrs. Brown doing the Christmas shopping, and both Jonathan and Judy are away at school. They're not due home until tomorrow, so I've been left in charge. The man looked relieved. This Mrs. Bird, he said, I would like to know more about her. Do I take it she isn't a very good cook? Not a very good cook, repeated Paddington indignantly. Mrs. Bird's dumplings are the best I've ever tasted. They're well known in the neighbourhood. Dumplings well known in neighbourhood, repeated the man, making an entry on his form. So is her marmalade, said Paddington. It's full of chunks. Feeling under his hat, he produced a sandwich. You can try this one if you like. I made it myself the week before last. It looked somewhat the worse for wear, and the man eyed it doubtfully. I think I would rather not, he said. I always keep one under my hat, in case of an emergency, explained Paddington. But nothing's gone wrong for several weeks now. I don't suppose you happen to keep one of Mrs. Bird's dumplings under there as well, do you? Asked the man. I could take a picture of it on my mobile. A dumpling? Exclaimed Paddington. Under my hat? He gave the interviewer a very hard stare indeed. The man's voice trailed away as he caught the look on Paddington's face. May I ask how you got here in the first place? He inquired, hurriedly changing the subject. I came in a small boat, said Paddington. I was a stowaway. All the way from darkest Peru. The interviewer raised his eyebrows. I know a lot of you boat people are desperate, but that sounds like a world record to me. Your paws must have been very sore after all that rowing. Oh, I didn't have to row, said Paddington. The boat was fixed to the side of a big ship. It was my Aunt Lucy's idea. I was a stowaway. All the same, said the man, it can't have been easy. It certainly wasn't in the Bay of Biscuit, said Paddington. I had a job to stand up. The sea was so rough I nearly got washed overboard several times. Surely you mean the Bay of Biscay, said the man. I call it the Bay of Biscuits, said Paddington firmly. Someone was hanging over the ship's rails, and they let go of a Garibaldi by mistake. It landed on my head, so I had it for dinner. I felt much better afterwards. How many bees are there in Garibaldi? Asked the man as he wrote it down. There aren't bees in Garibaldi, said Paddington. They have currants instead. Taking a deep breath, the interviewer reached for his razor. This Aunt Lucy of yours, he continued, can you tell me more about her? Well, said Paddington, she's very wise. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here at all. Besides, she's taught me all I know. Perhaps you could let me have her address, said the man. I'd like to take her on board and make her part of my team. She sounds just like the kind of person we're looking for. I don't think that would be very easy, said Paddington. She's living in the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. Besides, she doesn't play any ball games. The interviewer gave Paddington a glassy stare as he reached for his eraser again. I had a clean form when I started out this morning, he said plaintively. Now look at it. I suppose, he continued, trying another tack, since your Aunt Lucy is in a home, is there an uncle by any chance? Oh yes, said Paddington, Uncle Pastuzo. But we haven't seen him since the earthquake. You mean you're an earthquake victim? The man's pen fairly raced across the page. Tell me more. Well, said Paddington, there's not much to tell. I was fast asleep in a tree at the time. There was a loud rumble and the earth began to shake. When I woke up, everything looked different. Everyone else, apart from Aunt Lucy, had disappeared. Even your Uncle Pastuzo, said the interviewer. Especially Uncle Pastuzo, said Paddington. I think he must have known it was going to happen because he went out early that day. But he left his old hat and a suitcase with a secret compartment behind, along with a note to say I could have them if anything happened to him. And you've never heard of any more of him since? Paddington shook his head sadly. That's why Aunt Lucy brought me up. She taught me my tables, and she taught me to say please and thank you when I'm out shopping and to raise my hat whenever I meet someone I know. She also taught me to count my blessings when things look black. It's the first thing she does when she wakes in the morning. She says 9 times out of 10, you have more than you think you have. Would there were more like her, said the man. He turned the page. One last thing before I leave you in peace. What are your feelings about being a blood donor? No, thank you, said Paddington firmly. I haven't had my 11s as yet, and it might make me go wibbly-woo. I shouldn't let that worry you, said the man. You can lie down afterwards, and they give you a nice cup of tea into the bargain. I prefer cocoa, said Paddington. Bears do, you know. No, I didn't know that, said the man, entering the information on his form. While we're on the subject of medical matters, he continued, if you don't fancy being a blood donor, how about donating one of your organs when the time comes? Paddington considered the matter for a moment or two. He wondered if he ought to mention Jonathan's mouth organ. It had been a 9 days' wonder at the time, and everybody had breathed a sigh of relief when he took it back to school with him after the holidays. "I don't have any myself," he said. The man concealed a smile. "Oh, but you must have," he said. "Everyone has organs." "Mr. Curry doesn't, for a start," said Paddington. "Oh dear," said the interviewer. "Poor man. What with that and having his pipes frozen, he must be in a terrible state. I dare say he has to be tended night and day." Paddington looked over his shoulder. "I don't think so," he said, lowering his voice. "He lives all by himself." The man followed the direction of Paddington's gaze. "It gets worse and worse," he said. "Is that why the curtains are drawn?" "Mrs. Bird says it's because he doesn't like people spying on him," said Paddington. "I'm not surprised," said the man, "if he has no organs." "Jonathan had one once," said Paddington, "but he swapped it with a boy at school for a pencil box." The interviewer's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. "Jonathan swapped one of his organs for a pencil box," he repeated. "Do you know which one it was?" "I don't know the name," said Paddington, "but it was very special. It had 2 tiers, one for ordinary pencils and another one for crayons." "I don't mean the pencil box," said the man. "I mean which organ. This could be headline news. It's just the kind of material my editor is looking for." "Oh dear," said Paddington, suddenly wondering if he had said the right thing. "Are you absolutely certain you don't want to set an example?" said the man. "I wasn't meaning today, of course. It won't happen until after you—" He shifted uneasily underneath Paddington's hard stare. "Well, you know, after, After, repeated Paddington. "That's right," said the man. "It happens to us all the time, at some time." "It hasn't happened to me yet," said Paddington. "I can see that," said the man, looking as though he was beginning to wish it had. "One last thing," he remarked casually. "Can you tell me the name of Jonathan's school?" "I'm very sorry," said Paddington, raising his hat politely to show the conversation was at an end. "I'm afraid I can't." "What's it worth?" asked the interviewer, taking out his wallet. He fingered some notes. "More than all the tea in China," said Paddington, remembering one of Mrs. Bird's favourite phrases. "And if this doesn't work?" asked the man, detaching one of the notes, crackling it enticingly between his thumb and forefinger. "I have a secret weapon," said Paddington. "I'll show you if you like." Looking round to make sure nobody was watching, he gave the interviewer one of his hardest stares ever. The man shuddered as though he had been struck by lightning and something fell to the ground. "That's another thing Aunt Lucy taught me," said Paddington. "It comes in very useful at times." "I think I might call it a day," said the man, hastily retrieving his pen. He handed the note across the railings. "You'd better have this anyway. It may help you make your ends meet before Christmas. We're giving them away this week," he added. "It's a thank-you present." And with that he turned on his heels and disappeared down Windsor Gardens as though he had a train to catch. Paddington gazed at the note for a moment or two. It didn't look like any sort of money he had seen before. Instead of the pound sign, there was a picture of an aeroplane, followed by a lot of words in small print. None of them seemed to make any sense, so he slipped it into his duffel coat pocket for safekeeping and hurried back into the house in case anyone else came along wanting to interview him. "What do you think ums are?" asked Mr. Brown. It was the following day, and he had just arrived back from the station, having collected Jonathan and Judy, who were home for the Christmas holiday. "You've been reading Paddington's postcard, Henry," said Mrs. Brown accusingly. "I couldn't help it," said Mr. Brown. "It was lying on the hall table, ready to be posted. Anyway, it sounds as though you've read it too." "It's addressed to his Aunt Lucy," said Mrs. Brown. "I have no idea what it means, but he told her not to worry." "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "a spoonful of castor oil might not be amiss." "Poor old Paddington," said Judy. "Worse things happen at sea," said Jonathan cheerfully. "I don't know about that," said Mr. Brown. "Look at this headline." He held up the front page of a local newspaper. "Organ replacement scandal rocks London's West End." "I can't say I felt any tremors," said Mrs. Bird, reading it out loud. "I don't know where they get all these stories from in the first place," agreed Mrs. Brown. "I can't believe half of them are true. It doesn't sound like anywhere round here, thank goodness." "I wouldn't be too sure," warned Mr. Brown. "It's the same postcode as ours, W11. He continued reading. "Where will it all end?" asked our man on the spot. Posing as an interviewer, our intrepid reporter, Mervyn Doom, managed to infiltrate the gang and obtain in-depth information from one of its hammer-carrying members. "It makes it sound like some kind of ball game," interrupted Mrs. Brown. Where on earth did you get the paper?" "On Paddington Station, while I was waiting for the train," said Mr. Brown. Apparently the person he interviewed was disguised as a jobbing gardener. He gave the game away by saying he was looking for some outward-facing rosebuds, not realizing it was long past the normal pruning season. He looked up from the paper. "Can you imagine? It shows the type of person the authorities are up against." During the course of the interview, our informant also let slip the fact that an undercover trade in organ transplants is rife. A local schoolboy swapped one of his for a pencil box. The name of the boy in the school had been withheld for legal reasons. Meanwhile, in this outwardly respectable neighborhood, others, bereft of everything that makes them tick, lie behind drawn curtains waiting for help. "What is the world coming to?" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "And another thing," continued Mr. Brown. "According to this paper, the gates are about to open on a flood of boat people coming from Peru. Our question is, when will something be done about it? There is no time to be lost," all in big capital letters. "Does it say who's behind it?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Apparently the gang master-in-chief is a woman," said Mr. Brown, "notorious for her dumplings, and wielding an iron bar, she so terrifies those around her, the subject of the interview is forced to hide his marmalade sandwiches under his hat." The Browns looked at one another. Suddenly it was all starting to sound much closer to home than they had thought. "You don't think," began Mr. Brown. "Oh dear, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, "I'm very much afraid I do." "He asked if you could borrow your secateurs yesterday morning," said Mrs. Bird. "He wanted to do some work in the front garden." "Don't tell me he was having a go at my roses," exclaimed Mr. Brown, the full seriousness of the situation suddenly coming home to him. "I don't like the sound of that last bit," said Mrs. Bird. "If the powers that be get hold of the story, there's no knowing what will happen. We can await the ring on the front doorbell." The Browns exchanged anxious glances. In the beginning, Paddington had just sort of happened, but over the years he had become so much a part of the family they couldn't picture life without him. They had certainly never thought of him as being a refugee, still less the possibility of his being an illegal one. "I think they've started doing something about things already," said Jonathan. "I saw an ambulance outside Mr. Curry's house soon after we got back. There was a terrible row going on. They were trying to tie him onto a stretcher." "I suppose they might declare Paddington persona non grata," said Mr. Brown. "That means an unwelcome person," said Judy, for her brother's benefit. "Thanks a heap," said Jonathan, who got an A-star in his GCSE. "Anyway," said Judy, "he's not a person, he's a bear. And he's always welcome," chimed in Mrs. Bird. "If anyone tries to take him away after all this time, they'll have to deal with me." "Who in the world would want to report him?" asked Judy. "I imagine Mr. Curry for a start," said Jonathan. "If Paddington had anything to do with what happened this morning, perhaps we could hide him under the floorboards like the French did with escaped prisoners during the last war." "I shall never go out and leave that bear alone again," said Mrs. Bird. "I'm sure he meant well," said Mrs. Brown. "They can't," said Judy. "Take him away, I mean." "There's no such word in the English language as can't," said Mrs. Bird grimly. "What shall we tell Paddington?" broke in Mr. Brown, lowering his voice. "For the time being," said Mrs. Bird, "I suggest we don't tell him anything. He'll be more upset if he thinks the whole thing is his fault. He really will have trouble with his ums then," said Jonathan. "Careful," hissed Judy. "I think he's coming downstairs. I was wondering where he'd got to." Sure enough, a moment later the door opened and a familiar face appeared around the gap. "Can anyone tell me what air miles are?" asked Paddington. "Well," said Mr. Brown after he had gone, "that was a conversation stopper if ever I heard one. I wonder what he's up to now." "I shudder to think," said Mrs. Brown. "Time alone will tell," said Mrs. Bird. "I dare say we shall know soon enough."